The woman from the bank said my name twice before I even answered, like she already knew I wasn't going to believe what she was about to tell me. I was standing in my garage in Ohio, wrench still in my hand, grease on my knuckles, when she said the words that split my life into a before and an after. She said there was a trust account in my name worth $11 million, and it had been sitting there for almost 20 years. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, right there next to my old Ford, because it sounded like a scam, like one of those calls you hang up on before they ask for your social security number. But she knew my mother's maiden name, she knew my grandfather's date of death, she knew details nobody outside my family should have known. My hands started shaking before my brain even caught up to what was happening. I asked her to repeat the number, and she did, slow and careful, like she was talking to a man standing on a ledge. $11,300,000, held in a trust established by my grandfather, Walter Kessler, and administered, she said, by my own father for the last 19 years, my father, the man who taught me to fix transmissions in this exact garage, the man who once told me, with a straight face, that money was never our family's problem, that we were simple people who worked for what we had. I sat down on an overturned bucket because my legs stopped agreeing to hold me up. She told me the trust had been quietly renewed every 5 years, that someone with power of attorney kept extending it, kept it hidden, kept it moving through accounts that never once had my name attached to a statement I could actually see. I asked her who had power of attorney. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you the answer is going to hurt before you even hear it. She said, my mother. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further, because what happened next only makes sense if you know who I was before that phone call. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years believing my family and I were simply working class people who never caught a break. I grew up in a house where the heat got turned off twice, where my mother clipped coupons at the kitchen table under a bulb that flickered because we couldn't afford a new fixture. I remember my father coming home from the plant with oil under his fingernails, telling us dinner was going to be thin that week, telling us to be grateful for what we had. I believed him, I believed all of it. I worked 2 jobs through community college because there was no money for anything else. I took out loans I'm still paying off at 44 years old, loans that gutted my paycheck every single month while my parents supposedly struggled right alongside me. My younger sister, Melissa, got a car when she turned 18, a decent one, and I remember asking my father how we afforded it. He told me a cousin had died and left her a little something, and that it wasn't my business to ask more. I let it go, because that's what you do when your father tells you something isn't your business. Looking back now, sitting in that garage with a phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, I realized I had spent 2 decades being lied to by the 2 people who were supposed to protect me more than anyone else on earth. The woman on the phone, whose name was Patricia, told me the trust had been established the year my grandfather died, and that under the original terms, it was supposed to be split evenly between me and Melissa the moment we both turned 25. I turned 25 19 years ago, Melissa turned 25 16 years ago. Neither of us had ever been told the trust existed. Patricia said she was only calling because of a new compliance audit at the bank, a routine review triggered by federal reporting requirements on dormant high-value accounts, and that when she pulled my file, something about the pattern of transfers looked wrong enough that she felt obligated to reach the actual beneficiary directly, instead of just my father, who was still listed as trustee. I asked her what kind of pattern. She hesitated again, and I could hear her weighing how much she was allowed to say. Then she told me that over the last 6 years, more than $2 million had been withdrawn from the trust in structured payments, just under the amount that would trigger additional reporting. Structured payments, that's a banking term for money moved carefully enough to avoid attention. My father had been stealing from a trust that belonged to me, in amounts specifically designed so nobody would notice. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just stared at the pegboard on my garage wall where my wrenches hung in size order, the same pegboard my father helped me install 15 years ago, back when I still thought he was the most honest man I knew. Patricia asked if I wanted her to send documentation to my email. I said yes, my voice barely above a whisper, and I gave her my personal address instead of the one I shared with my wife, because some part of me already knew I needed to see this alone first. I hung up the phone and sat in that garage for almost 40 minutes without moving, replaying 20 years of memories through a lens that suddenly made every single one of them look different. The Thanksgiving my father cried about the mortgage payment, the year my mother sold her wedding ring, or said she did the birthday I turned 16 and there was no car, no party, just a cake from the grocery store and an apology about how tight things were. All of it, every single moment of manufactured struggle, while somewhere, quietly, $11 million sat waiting behind a wall of paperwork with my name on it. When I finally walked back into the house, my wife, Sarah, took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her I needed a minute, that I'd explain everything once I understood it myself, and she nodded because after 17 years of marriage, she knows when to give me space and when to hold my hand. That night I opened my laptop at nearly midnight and read every document Patricia sent me. Twice, then a third time, because I needed to make absolutely sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. The trust documents were signed by my grandfather for months before he died of a stroke at 78 years old. I remembered that day. I remembered my father crying at the funeral, telling everyone how much he loved his father-in-law, how much he'd miss him. What I didn't know, what nobody bothered to tell me, was that my grandfather had built a small but successful chain of hardware stores across 3 counties, sold the business 2 years before his death, and quietly split the proceeds into a trust meant to protect his grandchildren from ever struggling the way he once had. He left explicit instructions, equal shares, full disclosure to both grandchildren no later than their 25th birthdays, a named independent co-trustee, an attorney named Robert Ashford, who was supposed to oversee distributions alongside my father. I searched Robert Ashford's name and found his obituary. He died 6 years after my grandfather, and the moment he did, my father petitioned the court, using paperwork I'd never seen, to become sole trustee. Nobody told me there had ever been a hearing, nobody told me there had ever been a trust at all. I sat there in the blue light of my laptop screen and felt something inside my chest go cold and still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a person decides something they can never take back. The next morning I called my sister Melissa before I called anyone else, because if this was real, it wasn't just my inheritance that had been stolen, it was hers too. She answered on the second ring, sounding tired, a toddler crying somewhere behind her. Melissa had struggled for years at 2 jobs, a husband who left when their son was 2, a used minivan with 200,000 miles on it that she prayed would survive every winter. I asked her if she'd ever heard of a trust from Grandpa Walter. The silence on her end of the line told me everything before she even opened her mouth. She said Dad had mentioned something vague once, years ago, at a family dinner, something about how Grandpa's estate had mostly gone to cover his medical debts and funeral costs, and that there wasn't much left after everything was settled. I told her what Patricia told me, $11 million, structured withdrawals, a trust, meant for both of us, split down the middle by our own grandfather's written wishes. I heard her drop something in the background, maybe a phone, maybe a cup, and then I heard her start to cry in a way I hadn't heard since our grandfather's funeral itself. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I had the documents in front of me, the account statements, the trust agreement with our grandfather's actual signature on it. Everything. She asked the question that would define the next 6 months of both our lives. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her the truth. I told her I didn't know yet, but that I wasn't going to let this go quietly, not after 20 years of watching her drive a dying minivan and watching myself drown in student loan debt while our parents cried poor at every single holiday dinner. We agreed to meet in person before confronting anyone, because whatever this was, it needed to be handled carefully, with proof, with a plan, not with 2 angry adult children screaming across a kitchen table while our parents lawyered up and destroyed evidence. That decision, to slow down instead of exploding, turned out to be the single smartest thing either of us did in this entire story. I spent the next 2 weeks living a strange double life. I went to work at the auto shop I co-own with my business partner. I came home. I ate dinner with Sarah and our 2 kids. I laughed at the right moments and asked about homework and acted like a normal husband and father, but underneath all of it, I was quietly building a case. I hired an attorney named Denise Marlowe, a woman who specialized in trust litigation and elder financial abuse, someone Patricia at the bank had actually recommended off the record, telling me Denise had handled situations like this before and knew exactly how to move without tipping off the person being investigated. Denise's first question to me was simple. She asked if my grandfather had shown any signs of cognitive decline before he died, because if my father had manipulated an already vulnerable elderly man, that changed the entire legal strategy. I didn't know the answer, and that terrified me almost as much as the money itself. I started calling relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, an aunt on my mother's side, my grandfather's younger sister, still alive at 83 and sharp as a tack, living in an assisted living facility 2 hours away. Her name was Dorothy, and when I visited her, sitting in her small sunlit room decorated with photos of a family I barely recognized anymore, she told me something that made my stomach drop even further. She said my grandfather had called her, upset, about 6 months before he died, saying my father had been pressuring him to change his will, telling him the grandchildren weren't responsible enough to handle money and that everything should go through my father first to protect us from ourselves. My grandfather had refused. Dorothy said he told her, word for word, that he trusted his grandchildren more than he trusted anyone else in that family, and that the trust was going to be ironclad. No exceptions, no loopholes for anyone to control. For months later he was dead. I sat in that sunlit room with my hands clenched so tight my knuckles went white, and I asked Dorothy if she thought my father had anything to do with how he died. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. She said she didn't know, and that she'd wondered the same thing herself for 20 years, but that grief and suspicion aren't the same as proof, and that I needed to be very careful about which one I let drive me. That warning stayed with me for the rest of this story. Before I left her room that day, Dorothy told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail people mention right as you're standing up to go. She said my grandfather had once shown her a second document, a handwritten letter he kept folded inside his Bible, addressed to me and Melissa directly, meant to be given to us the day we learned about the trust. Nobody had ever mentioned a letter, not my father, not the bank, not a single page in the 412 pages of accounting we would later receive. I asked Dorothy if she remembered where the Bible had ended up after the funeral, and she said she believed it had gone home with my mother, packed away with the rest of his personal belongings nobody in the family had wanted to sort through at the time. That single sentence gave me a new mission. Quiet and separate from the lawsuit itself, somewhere in my parents' house, possibly still sitting on a shelf collecting dust, was a letter my grandfather had written specifically for me, words he'd chosen himself instead of words filtered through a trustee's summary letter. I didn't mention the letter to my father when we sat at that kitchen table with the folder of evidence between us. Some instinct told me to keep it quiet a little longer, to see if it would surface on its own once the pressure of the lawsuit started closing in around him. It did surface, eventually, but not in the way I expected. Denise pulled my grandfather's medical records with a court order, and what we found wasn't proof of murder. Nothing that dramatic. But it was something almost as damning in its own quiet way. The stroke that killed him happened 3 days after a cardiology appointment where his blood pressure medication had been changed. The prescribing doctor's records showed my father, listed as an emergency contact with limited medical authority, had called the office twice that week asking detailed questions about dosage adjustments. It wasn't murder. Denise was very clear about that, and I believed her, but it painted a picture of a man who had inserted himself deeply, quietly, methodically, into every corner of my grandfather's final months, positioning himself as the only person anyone needed to go through. Meanwhile, my mother's fingerprints were all over the actual theft. As power of attorney and co-signer on the trust's operating account, she had personally authorized dozens of the structured withdrawals Patricia flagged, transfers that fed, we discovered, into a second property my parents owned in Florida under an LLC. Neither Melissa nor I had ever heard of a vacation condo paid for in cash, while my sister drove a minivan held together with duct tape and prayer. I remember the night Denise showed me the LLC filing, my hands shaking so badly I had to set my coffee cup down before I dropped it. I asked her what our options were. She said we could go straight to a lawsuit, or we could try a more strategic route first, one that would give us leverage and protect the evidence before my parents had any chance to move money or destroy records. She suggested we request a formal accounting of the trust through the county probate court, something we were legally entitled to as named beneficiaries, before we ever confronted our parents directly. It felt cold, filing legal paperwork against my own mother and father without saying a word to them first, but Denise reminded me of something I needed to hear. She said the moment they knew we were onto them, any evidence still sitting in accessible accounts would disappear within days, so we filed quietly. The court granted the request within 3 weeks, ordering my father, as trustee, to produce a full financial accounting of the trust within 30 days. He had no idea it was coming from me. The accounting arrived in Denise's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March for 112 pages of transaction records, bank statements, and a trustee's summary letter that my father had clearly had help writing, because the language in it sounded nothing like the man who once explained to me how a carburetor worked, using nothing but grease-stained hands and simple words. The letter claimed the trust had been prudently managed and that all distributions were in accordance with the beneficiaries' best interests, language that made my jaw tighten every time I reread it, because neither beneficiary had ever been asked what our interests even were. Buried on page 281 was a withdrawal I almost missed for $100,000, transferred 11 years ago. Memo line reading simply Family Education Fund. I never received a single dollar of education funding beyond what I borrowed myself, neither did Melissa. I called her that night and read her the line over the phone. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that broke my heart all over again. She said maybe it went to our cousin, our father's sister's son, the one who went to law school while Melissa and I were both working nights to pay for community college. We checked. It had our cousin, a man named Trevor, had his entire law school tuition quietly paid for using money from a trust that belonged to us, a trust he never even knew existed, funded by a grandfather who had never met him more than a handful of times. I don't blame Trevor for any of this. He was just as much in the dark as we were, another person my father used without ever telling the truth to anyone in the family, but learning that stung in a way I wasn't prepared for, the realization that our father had spread our stolen inheritance across a web of decisions we never had any say in. Denise flagged something else buried in the accounting, something she said was actually more legally significant than the missing money itself. Several of my father's signatures as trustee, on documents dated after Robert Ashford's death, appeared to predate the actual court order that named him sole trustee. In plain terms, my father had been signing legal trust documents claiming authority he didn't yet legally have, weeks before a judge ever granted it to him. That single detail, Denise told me, was enough to potentially void his trusteeship entirely and open him up to real legal exposure, not just a civil dispute over mismanaged money, but potential fraud. I sat with that word for a long time. Fraud applied to my own father, the man who taught me to shake hands firmly and look people in the eye when I spoke to them. Melissa and I met again, this time at a diner outside the city where nobody would recognize us, sitting in a corner booth with coffee going cold between us while we decided what to do with everything Denise had uncovered. She asked me if I wanted to go public with it, file criminal charges, blow the whole thing up. I told her I didn't know yet, that part of me wanted justice and part of me still wanted, somehow, impossibly, an explanation that made all of this make sense. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, and she said something I'll never forget. She said our parents had already made their choice 20 years ago, the day they decided lying to their own children was easier than telling us the truth about money that was never theirs to control. We decided on a plan, not revenge in the way people picture it. No screaming confrontations. No dramatic scenes at Thanksgiving dinner, something quieter, something that would force the truth into the light on our terms. With the law fully on our side, Denise filed a formal petition demanding my father's removal as trustee, citing breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and improper distributions, supported by every piece of documentation we'd gathered over 3 months of careful, quiet work. The court set a hearing date for the following month. I decided my parents deserved to hear it from me first, not from a courtroom, not from a process server showing up at their door, not out of mercy exactly, but because some small part of me needed to look them in the eyes and ask why. I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon, the same house I grew up in, the same kitchen table where I'd watched my mother clip coupons under a flickering bulb that, I now understood, they could have replaced 1,000 times over without noticing the cost. My father was in the garage when I arrived, working on the same lawnmower he's been fixing for as long as I can remember. He smiled when he saw me, the same easy smile he's had my whole life, and asked if I wanted a beer. I told him we needed to talk, and something in my voice made that smile falter just slightly, just enough that I knew some part of him understood exactly what was coming. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, my mother wiping her hands on a dish towel even though they weren't wet, a nervous habit I recognized now for what it probably always was. I laid the folder on the table without a word, the trust agreement, the account statements, the LLC filing for the Florida condo, the $400,000 tuition payment to Trevor, all of it, organized, tabbed, undeniable. My mother's face went white. My father didn't touch the folder at all, he just stared at me, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. The only sound in the room, the hum of the refrigerator that had been running in that kitchen since I was in middle school. Finally, my father spoke, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said he'd always meant to tell us, that he was going to explain everything once the time was right, that he'd only ever been trying to protect the money from us until we were mature enough to handle it responsibly. I asked him what age that would have been, since I was 44 years old and had never received a single dollar, a single conversation, a single hint that any of this existed. He didn't have an answer for that. My mother started crying, saying it wasn't supposed to happen this way, that they were going to tell us eventually, that they'd just gotten used to how things were and it became easier to keep going than to ever start that conversation. I asked about the condo in Florida, neither of them answered. I asked about my grandfather's final months, about the medication changes, about the calls to his doctor. My father's face changed then, something harder settling into his features, and he said I had no right to bring that up, that he'd loved his father-in-law and everything he did was in that man's best interest. I told him the court might see it differently. That's when he finally understood this wasn't a conversation, it was a warning. 2 weeks before the hearing, Denise received an unexpected envelope at her office, no return address, postmarked from a town 3 hours away where my mother's cousin lived. Inside was a single photocopied page, my grandfather's handwriting unmistakable even in copy form, along with an unsigned note that simply read, "She kept this. You deserve to see it." Denise called me the moment she opened it, her voice tight with the kind of controlled excitement lawyers get when a case suddenly tips further in their favor. She read me the letter over the phone, and I had to ask her to stop twice so I could catch my breath. My grandfather had written that he was leaving Melissa and me equal shares of everything he'd built, not because we'd earned it yet, but because he believed we would grow into people who deserved it, people who worked hard and stayed honest, the same values he tried to build his hardware stores around for 40 years. He wrote that he trusted us more than he trusted anyone else left in the family, and that if anyone ever tried to keep this money from us, we should fight for it, because it was never meant to be anyone's secret to keep. He signed it the way he signed every card he ever gave me growing up, simply, "Love, Grandpa Walter," and reading those 2 words in Denise's voice over the phone undid something in me that 3 months of legal paperwork hadn't managed to touch. I never found out for certain who mailed that copy, though I have a strong suspicion it came from my mother's cousin, a woman who had apparently known about the letter's existence for years and finally decided silence had gone on long enough. Denise entered it into the record as supporting evidence of my grandfather's clear, unambiguous intent, further undercutting any argument that my father had simply been exercising reasonable trustee discretion. The hearing took place 6 weeks later in a quiet courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee, my father seated across the aisle with the defense attorney he'd hired the week after our kitchen table conversation, my mother beside him looking smaller than I'd ever seen her look in my entire life. Denise walked the judge through everything, methodically, without a hint of the anger I felt sitting beside her, presenting the evidence the way you'd lay out pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, left absolutely no room for interpretation. My father's attorney tried to argue that the withdrawals were reasonable trustee compensation and family support consistent with discretionary authority. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Alvarez who had clearly seen every version of this story before, asked a single pointed question that seemed to end the argument before it really began. She asked where the written documentation was showing either beneficiary had ever consented to or even been informed of any discretionary distributions. There wasn't any, there never had been. The judge ruled from the bench 2 hours later. My father was removed as trustee, effective immediately, replaced by a court-appointed independent fiduciary. She ordered a full forensic audit of every transaction going back to the trust's creation, ordered a freeze on the Florida property pending further review, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation into fraud and elder financial exploitation. Outside the courtroom, waiting for the elevator, my mother approached me alone, my father still inside speaking with his attorney about next steps. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age, and held it out to me without a word. I opened it right there in the hallway, and tucked inside the back cover was the original letter, the handwritten one Denise had only seen in photocopy, my grandfather's actual signature pressed into paper that still smelled faintly like the cedar chest it had probably been stored in for 19 years. My mother said she'd meant to give it to me eventually, that she just never found the right moment. And I remember thinking that 19 years was an awfully long time to keep waiting for a right moment that conveniently never arrived on its own. I took the Bible, I didn't say thank you, and I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, not yet, maybe not ever entirely, but I held on to that letter the whole ride home, reading it 3 more times at red lights, hearing my grandfather's voice and words he'd written for me before I was even old enough to understand what trust really meant. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I felt hollowed out, watching my father's face as the ruling was read, watching 20 years of quiet family lies collapse into a single afternoon inside a courtroom that didn't care about family loyalty, only about what could be proven. The criminal investigation took another 8 months. I won't walk through every detail, because some of it is still difficult for me to talk about even now, but I'll tell you the parts that matter. The forensic audit confirmed nearly $3 million had been diverted from the trust over 19 years, some to the Florida property, some to Trevor's tuition, some simply absorbed into my parents' everyday lifestyle, a lifestyle they carefully disguised behind coupon clipping and complaints about tight mortgages that, it turned out, had been paid off almost a decade earlier. My father accepted a plea deal rather than risk trial, pleading guilty to a reduced charge that avoided prison time but required full restitution and 5 years of probation, along with a permanent bar from ever serving as a fiduciary or trustee again in the state. My mother wasn't criminally charged, but she was named in the civil judgment alongside him, jointly responsible for repaying every dollar that had been diverted, plus interest, plus legal fees, an amount that ultimately forced them to sell the house I grew up in and the condo in Florida both, just to satisfy the judgment. I want to be honest with you about something. There was no moment where I felt pure satisfaction watching that happen. I felt grief mixed with something that almost resembled relief, the strange exhausted peace that comes after finally putting down a weight you didn't even realize you'd been carrying your entire adult life. Melissa and I received our full restitution 11 months after that first phone call from Patricia at the bank, split evenly, exactly the way our grandfather had always intended, down to the last documented dollar, plus statutory interest for every year it had been wrongfully withheld. The first thing Melissa did was pay off her minivan loan and put a down payment on a reliable car that wouldn't strand her and her son on the side of the road in February. The second thing she did was start a small college fund for him, the very thing our own parents had stolen from us, now protected in an account with an independent trustee neither of us would ever have to worry about again. I paid off every student loan I'd been carrying since I was 19 years old, the debt that had shaped to decades of choices, vacations we never took, a bigger house we never bought, sacrifices Sarah and I made silently while somewhere, quietly, our family sat on money that could have erased every bit of it in an afternoon. I didn't quit my job at the auto shop. People sometimes ask me that, assuming $11 million means walking away from the life you built, but that shop, that garage, those wrenches hanging in size order on the pegboard, that's who I actually am, separate from any number in a bank account. What changed wasn't my life's shape. What changed was the fear underneath it. I did do one thing differently. I used part of the money to buy out my business partner's remaining debt on the shop and expanded it, hired 3 more mechanics, started a scholarship program for local kids in vocational training who couldn't afford tools and certification costs, kids exactly like I used to be, standing in a garage, dreaming bigger than their bank account allowed. My relationship with my parents didn't end in some dramatic final scene. It ended the way most painful things actually end in real life, slowly, quietly, through fewer phone calls and shorter conversations, until eventually there weren't really conversations left to have. My mother reached out about a year after everything settled, asking if we could talk, if there was any way to rebuild what had been broken. I met her once, at a coffee shop instead of the family kitchen table, neutral ground for a conversation that needed it. She apologized. I believe some part of that apology was genuine, but she also spent a good portion of that conversation explaining her reasoning, justifying decisions instead of simply owning them, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation I understood something important about forgiveness that I hadn't understood before. About would just be another form of the same unfairness that started this entire story. We're actually closer now than we ever were growing up, two people who got tangled up in the same family's secrets from opposite ends. Dorothy, my great-aunt, passed away peacefully about 4 months ago, and I made sure to visit her every few weeks in the time I had left with her. I told her, near the end, that her honesty in that small sunlit room had been the thread that unraveled everything, and she squeezed my hand and told me my grandfather would be proud of how I'd handled it, patient, careful, through the truth instead of through anger. I keep that Bible on the shelf in my own living room now, right at eye level, where I see it every single morning before I leave for the shop. Sometimes I open it just to read the letter again, not because I've forgotten the words, but because hearing them still feels like sitting across from him one more time, the way I used to as a kid, watching him count out change behind the counter of his first hardware store and explain to me why honesty was the only kind of currency that actually held its value over time. I framed a copy of the letter too, a smaller one, and gave it to Melissa for her birthday that year. She cried when she opened it, right there at her kitchen table, her son asking why Mommy was crying at a piece of paper, and she told him it was because his great-great-grandfather had loved her more than she ever fully understood until this past year. I think about that conversation often, how something my grandfather wrote decades before that little boy was even born ended up shaping how he'll understand honesty and family for the rest of his own life. I think about my grandfather a lot these days, a man who built something from nothing, who worked his hands raw running hardware stores across 3 counties, who wanted nothing more than to make sure his grandchildren never had to feel the kind of fear he probably felt as a young man starting out with nothing. He never got to see us receive what he left us, but I like to believe, in whatever way makes sense to believe these things, that he knows now that somewhere, the truth finally caught up to the lie, exactly the way he built it to, with an ironclad trust and a co-trustee system designed specifically to protect us from exactly what happened. It just took one honest bank employee named Patricia, doing her job a little more thoroughly than she had to finally set that protection into motion 19 years later than it should have started. I think about what would have happened if she hadn't called, if that compliance audit had flagged a different account first, or never happened at all. I think about growing old never knowing, dying someday with my father's secret intact, my sister still driving that dying minivan, both of us believing our family had simply never caught a break. That thought used to make me angry. Now it mostly just makes me grateful for one small, honest phone call that changed the entire trajectory of 2 lives that had already spent 2 decades believing a lie. Sarah asked me recently if I regret any part of how I handled it. The slow investigation, the quiet legal filings, choosing evidence over confrontation, patience over rage. I told her the only thing I regret is not asking more questions 20 years earlier, back when a flickering kitchen light bulb should have seemed like a stranger detail than it did at the time. My kids are growing up differently now. Not because of the money exactly, though that certainly helps in ways I won't pretend don't matter. They're growing up differently because I promised myself, the day that ruling came down in that courtroom, that whatever else changed in my life, honesty inside our own family would never again be optional. I still work in that garage most days. I still come home smelling like motor oil and hard work, but the fear that used to sit underneath every financial decision, every worry about my kids' college, every quiet dread about retirement, that fear is gone now, replaced by something steadier, something closer to actual peace. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, someone close enough that you never saw it coming? I'd love to read your story in the comments below, because honestly, hearing from this community has helped me process my own experience more than I expected it to. If this story moved you even a little, I'd be grateful if you hit that like button and subscribed to the Revenge Diaries, because stories like this one only find the people who need them most when this community helps them travel a little further. And if you know someone who's ever felt like their own family kept them in the dark, maybe send this one their way. Sometimes the story that finds someone at exactly the right moment is the thing that finally gives them permission to ask the questions they've been afraid to ask their entire life. Before you go, stick around, because I've got another story waiting for you. One about a woman who discovered her husband had been secretly paying another family's mortgage for 12 years, and trust me, the truth behind that one is even harder to see coming than mine was.